Evelyn Brooks laughed when she saw the burned-out Corvette sitting in the middle of a salvage yard, then coldly told Mason Carter that the charred wreck was only worth scrap metal. She had no idea that the man in the oil-stained shirt standing before her had once been a street racing legend who made the underground circuit tremble. She had even less idea that the incinerated car wasn't being rebuilt to be sold, it was being reborn for a secret race where the winner could change their life forever, and the loser would walk away with nothing left at all. Stay with this until the end, because Evelyn's laughter was only the beginning of a reversal nobody saw coming. The rain came in sideways that afternoon, the kind that blurred the outline of everything it touched and turned the outskirts of Detroit into a smear of gray and rust. The salvage yard, behind Mason Carter's garage, had no name on the gate and no reason to advertise one, because nobody visited it for pleasure. Old bumpers leaned against chain-link fences, engine blocks sat on cracked asphalt, and the smell of burned rubber and standing water had soaked into the very ground. Most people drove past without looking. Mason Carter had spent the last 11 months looking at nothing else. He crouched beneath the hood of a 1968 Corvette that looked, to any reasonable eye, like the aftermath of a catastrophe. The body panels were scorched black, the windshield had spider-webbed from the heat, and the interior was a hollow ruin of melted foam and bare steel. To anyone else on Earth, it was garbage. To Mason, it was the only card he had left to play. Inside the small office attached to the garage, a 10-year-old girl named Madison Carter sat at a metal desk with a spiral notebook open in front of her. She was drawing, as she often did during the long hours her father worked, and every few minutes she pressed her face closer to the glass partition to check on him. She could tell when he was tired, not from anything he said, but from the particular stillness that came over him when he stopped moving between tasks and simply stood with both hands resting on the frame of the car, staring into the burned-out engine bay like he was reading something written inside it. She had learned not to ask about those moments. Instead, she drew pictures of the car, sometimes with flames coming off it and sometimes with light. Mason had kept a particular drawer in his desk, locked for nearly a year. It held 3 things: a hospital invoice, a payment schedule printed on blue paper, and a letter from the surgical coordinator at Detroit Children's Hospital explaining that Madison's congenital heart condition had entered a critical phase. The valve replacement she needed was not optional and not deferrable. The procedure required a deposit of $42,000 before scheduling could begin, and that figure climbed each time the date slipped. Mason had looked at those numbers every night after Madison fell asleep, turning them over in his mind, the way a man tests the weight of something he can barely lift. He had taken every job the neighborhood sent his way, had sold his personal tools twice over and replaced them with cheaper ones, had eaten lunch from a vending machine for most of the past 6 months. The gap between what he had and what he needed had not closed. It had widened. Evelyn Brooks arrived in a convoy of 3 vehicles, all of them the kind of cars that made the street look inadequate. She stepped out in a charcoal blazer with her dark hair pulled back precisely, flanked by 2 assistants and a man in a polo shirt holding a tablet with property maps on the screen. The purpose of the visit was not mechanical. Brooks Automotive, the luxury performance brand Evelyn had inherited from her father and grown into a billion-dollar enterprise, had identified this stretch of road on the edge of the industrial district as the ideal site for a new brand experience center. The garage occupied a corner of that site. The garage, therefore, had to go. Evelyn walked through the open bay door without knocking, which was the kind of behavior that told you more about a person than anything they would ever choose to say out loud. Her eyes moved across the garage in quick assessment, cataloging everything as either useful or irrelevant, and the Corvette fell immediately into the second category. One of her assistants murmured that the model year suggested it could have collector value if it hadn't been destroyed. Evelyn glanced at it for perhaps 2 seconds, then looked at Mason and asked whether he was building a coffin or a piece of failed art. The people behind her laughed, because laughter was one of the currencies she traded in, and they had learned the exchange rate. Mason straightened from the engine bay, wiped his hands on a shop rag that had long since given up being clean, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said the car wasn't dead yet. Evelyn looked at him the way people sometimes look at someone standing in a line for something they'll never actually receive, with a faint, reflexive pity that barely cleared the threshold of actual attention. She presented her offer for the land. The number was so far below assessed value that Mason initially assumed he had misheard it. He had not misheard it, Evelyn explained, with the measured patience of someone accustomed to people agreeing with her eventually, that the offer reflected the current state of the property, the cost of clearing it, and the fact that her company's presence in the neighborhood would raise surrounding values regardless. Mason said no. The garage was the last physical thing his late wife Grace had owned. It was the place where Madison had taken her first steps and drawn her first pictures. It was the only address his daughter had ever known. Evelyn's response was not anger, she was too composed for that, but it carried a precision that was in some ways worse. She told him that the company had several ways of making relocation the more attractive option, and he would be wise to consider them before she was forced to demonstrate that point. As she turned to leave, she paused one more time in front of the Corvette and suggested that if Mason had any real intelligence, he would sell the wreck by weight before it cost him more than it was worth. Mason looked at the car, then back at her. He said quietly that some things only look like they've burned all the way through. Evelyn didn't answer. She walked out into the rain and got back into her car, and the convoy pulled away from the curb, like it had never needed to stop in the first place. Madison had been standing just inside the office door through most of it, holding her notebook, listening to every word. That evening, after the last customer had gone and the bay doors were pulled down and locked, Mason sat across from Madison at the small kitchen table behind the garage and told her the woman had simply been confused about the car. He explained it the way he explained most things to his daughter, directly, without talking down to her, but carefully, leaving out the weight of it. He said that some people looked at something and only saw what it used to be, not what it could become. Madison accepted this with the particular seriousness of children who know they are being told part of a truth and are choosing to trust the person telling it. After dinner, she drew a new picture in her notebook. The Corvette from the front, its scorched headlights aimed straight ahead, a faint glow where the engine should be. Later that night, Mason opened the locked drawer. He had received a call from the hospital earlier in the week that he hadn't told Madison about. The surgical coordinator had explained, gently but without room for misinterpretation, that Madison's condition was progressing more quickly than they had initially projected. The window for the best possible surgical outcome was narrowing. If a deposit wasn't received within the next several weeks, the hospital would have to release the scheduled slot, and Madison would move to a general waiting list, which carried its own set of risks. Mason had listened to the call from the break room behind the garage, leaning against a shelf of used oil filters, staring at the concrete floor. He had said he understood and thanked the coordinator and hung up. Then he had stood there for a long time without moving. He walked back out to the car. The Corvette had not always looked like this. When Grace was alive, it had been her project, a second-generation body she'd found at an estate auction with original block numbers still intact. A car she'd described as a blank promise. Grace Carter had been an electrical engineer with a talent for finding potential in things that had been written off. And she had spent 2 years working with Mason on a restoration plan. Their intention had been to enter it in a sanctioned performance class, to race it together the way they used to talk about when they were young. And the future felt like something they had designed themselves. Then Grace's accident had happened, and the project had stopped, and Mason had covered the car with a tarp and left it in the back corner of the yard and done his best not to look at it. He still had the metal box he kept on a shelf in the office, the one Madison had asked about once, and he had told her held old paperwork. Inside the box was a set of chassis drawings, a handwritten note from Grace about torque targets and suspension geometry, a pair of fireproof racing gloves, and a photograph of Grace standing next to the Corvette before the fire, grinning with motor oil on her cheek, and her arms crossed like she had just won an argument. Mason picked up the photograph for the first time in months. He could hear her voice clearly in the silence of the garage, saying what she had always said about the car and about everything else that people tried to dismiss. It wasn't built to sit still and be pitied. It was built to prove something. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text was brief. It said that Black Meridian was coming back, that the purse was large enough to save whatever he still cared about losing, and that there was a time and a place. Attached was a set of coordinates and a small graphic, a flat black circle bisected by a single line, the symbol Mason had seen on invitation cards and wristbands years ago. In another version of his life, he set the phone down on the workbench and looked at Madison through the office window. She was asleep at the desk, her notebook open to the drawing of the car. He looked back at the Corvette. He had told himself he was done with that world. He had believed it. Mostly. For a long time. But the world, it appeared, was not done with him. The address on the message led to an industrial warehouse on the far edge of the west side, the kind of building with no signage and enough square footage to absorb sound entirely. Mason arrived just after midnight, 3 days after he had received the text. He had told Madison he was meeting a parts supplier. The lie had sat badly with him the whole drive over, but he had told it anyway. Inside the warehouse, Wyatt Reed was already there, standing next to a folding table, with a hand wrapped around a paper coffee cup, like a man who had been waiting comfortably for a while. Wyatt ran Black Meridian. He had been running it, in various forms and under various pretexts, for nearly 15 years. He was not a man who surprised easily. But when Mason walked through the side door, something in his expression shifted into genuine satisfaction. Wyatt said he had heard Mason was still in town, still in the garage, still invisible. He said he'd wondered if the invitation would get a response. Mason asked what Black Meridian was offering this year that was different from every other year. Wyatt explained that the prize structure had evolved. The winner would receive a cash purse and, more significantly, an exclusive performance engineering contract with a private automotive investment group. A contract worth well over $1 million across 2 years, with full intellectual property rights retained by the engineer. Mason listened without expression. Then Wyatt told him who else was on the entry list. Brooks Automotive had signed on as a corporate participant. Evelyn Brooks was sending a full factory entry. A prototype designated the Brooks Venom to Black Meridian as a live promotional event. The lead engineer behind the Venom was Logan Pierce. Mason didn't say anything for a moment. Logan Pierce had been his closest friend and technical collaborator during the years when Mason still raced. They had built engines together in this same part of the city, in smaller and colder spaces than this one, and they had trusted each other the way you trust someone when you're both working towards something that feels bigger than either of you. Then, Logan had taken Mason's proprietary combustion mapping system, 3 years of refinement, a notebook of calculations, a stack of dyno printouts, and sold it to a group of investors who had turned it into a licensed performance package without Mason's knowledge or consent. Mason had confronted him. Logan had denied it, then minimized it, then disappeared into a new job with a well-funded team that didn't ask questions about where the ideas came from. Mason had never been able to prove the theft formally. He had also never been able to stop thinking about what came after. The chain of events that had led to the race he'd entered in anger. The corner he'd pushed too hard on. The crash that had taken Grace from him and Madison from her mother. Wyatt said that Logan was expecting to use Black Meridian to cement his reputation as the top performance engineer in the country and leverage it into a promotion within Brooks. He said Evelyn wanted the brand visibility of winning a race that the wealthiest people in 6 states watched with their own money on the table. He said if Mason showed up with a burned-out Corvette, he'd be the joke that made the whole event more entertaining. Mason said he wasn't there to be entertainment. He drove home without committing to anything, but he already knew what he was going to do. The knowledge sat in his chest the whole way back. heavier than guilt and quieter than rage. And when he pulled into the garage and turned off the engine, he sat in the dark for a long time before going inside. The work began the following night. Mason was methodical in a way that other mechanics rarely were, not because he was slow, but because he understood that speed in preparation was almost always paid back in failure during execution. He pulled the burned wiring harness out of the Corvette in a single long session, spread it on the garage floor, and mapped every circuit by hand before he replaced a single connector. He rebuilt the subframe mounts with steel stock he cut and welded himself. He sourced a short block from a wrecked car 3 states away, had it delivered by freight, and spent 4 nights reworking the internal clearances, the oiling channels, and the combustion chamber geometry. The result was nothing that appeared on any manufacturer's specification sheet. It was something Mason had arrived at through his own calculations and his own memory of what a car needed to do when the rules of the road no longer applied. He kept the exterior exactly as it was. The scorched black body panels stayed. The cracked grille stayed. The hazed headlight lenses stayed. The car looked, from the outside, like it had just been towed from a fire and left to rot. That was the point. Mason had learned long ago that the cars people underestimated were the ones they didn't bother to plan for. Evelyn's team would build their strategy around threats they could measure. A ruined Corvette driven by a man they had already laughed at would not read as a threat. It would read as scenery. He sold the last few things in the garage that held personal value, including the watch Grace had given him on their first anniversary, a simple field watch that he had worn every day for years and taken off only when working. He bought components with the money: 2 sets of custom compound tires appropriate for mixed surface conditions, a brake bias bar that he fabricated himself from a schematic he had drawn from memory, and a set of coilover inserts that he hand-valved in the late hours, when the garage was silent, except for the sound of the rain and his own breathing. He had no support team, no data logger running to a laptop in a pit lane, no sponsor with an interest in the outcome. He had what he had always had: the ability to feel through the steering column what most engineers couldn't read off a screen. A woman named Isabella Grant arrived at the garage on a Thursday morning with a story about a coolant leak in a 4-cylinder sedan that Mason could see at a glance was entirely invented. She was in her mid-30s, unhurried in her movement, and she asked questions about the neighborhood with the practiced casualness of someone who asks questions for a living. Mason let her talk for a while before he told her the car was fine and asked what she actually wanted. Isabella dropped the pretense without embarrassment. She was an investigative journalist who had been tracking Black Meridian for the better part of 2 years, following a thread that connected the event to a pattern of financial manipulation. Short positions opened against automotive companies just before high-profile engineering failures, prize money flowing through shell companies, and at least 2 accidents that she believed had been caused by deliberate technical interference rather than driver error. She knew Mason had once competed under the name Ghost Line. She told him she wasn't there to expose him. She was there to warn him. Mason told her he appreciated the concern, but didn't know her well enough to trust it. Isabella opened a folder and slid a document across the workbench. It was a technical inspection report, partially redacted, filed after Grace Carter's fatal crash, and then reclassified as internal evidence in a civil proceeding that was later settled out of court. The report contained a finding that the brake pressure distribution system on Grace's car had shown signs of external modification. Not wear, not failure modification. Someone had accessed the system before the race. The findings had been buried in the settlement paperwork and never reached Mason because he had not been a party to the civil case. He read the document 3 times. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. He had spent 5 years believing the crash was his fault, his planning, his car preparation, his decision to race that night. He had carried that as a kind of penance, the debt he owed for the life Madison had been left to live without her mother. The document did not say he was innocent of every mistake, but it said he had not been the only cause. Isabella told him that the financial signature around the crash pointed toward someone who had known in advance that Grace's car would fail. The most probable candidate, based on the betting records she had reconstructed, was a participant who had a strong financial and professional motive for removing the leading competitor from that race. Logan Pierce had been present at the event. Logan Pierce had subsequently signed with a well-funded team and begun building a career on an engine architecture that bore a striking resemblance to designs Mason had never made public. Mason stood very still for a long time. Then he walked to the Corvette, put his hands on the engine bay, and stood there in silence long enough that Isabella didn't speak again until he turned around. He told her to come back when she had more. She said she would. Madison discovered the project entirely by accident, the way children discover most adult secrets, not through snooping but through the logic of observation accumulated over time. She had noticed her father going back to the garage after she was supposed to be asleep, had heard the sound of tools in the hours before dawn, had seen the change in the Corvette each morning when she passed by. One night she came down in her socks and her pajama top with the astronaut on the front and stood in the garage doorway watching him work. Mason saw her and set down the torque wrench and sat on the bumper of the car and asked how long she'd known. She said long enough. He told her to come over, and she sat next to him on the cold bumper, and he explained, carefully and in language that told her the truth, without giving her the full weight of it, that the car had belonged to her mother and that he was fixing it because it needed to be finished. She asked if her mother had loved it. He said Grace had loved it the way she loved every difficult thing, stubbornly, completely, and with full belief in what it could become. Madison reached out and pressed her palm flat against the scorched door panel. She left her hand there for a moment, then asked if she could see inside. He showed her the instrument panel. He had been working on a small piece near the base of the center console, a strip of aluminum that most people would never notice. He had engraved 2 names into it, Grace and Madison. He explained that Grace had believed in second chances, not as comfort but as fact, and that the car was his way of honoring that belief. Madison didn't say anything for a while. Then she unclipped the thin braided bracelet she wore on her left wrist, a friendship bracelet she had made herself, blue and white cord, the kind she had been making since she was 7, and she looped it around the base of the gear shift. She said he should take it with him. She said she knew he was going to race it, and she wanted him to have something of hers when he did. Mason held on to the gear shift for a moment without speaking. He drove her back to bed and sat in the chair next to her until she fell asleep. 2 nights before the event, Logan Pierce came to the garage on Evelyn's behalf. He arrived alone this time, without the corporate entourage, which Mason read immediately as a sign that this visit was not entirely official. Logan looked the same as Mason remembered him, sharp in the face, dressed in the studied casualty of someone who spent money to look like they didn't, except that there was something tight around his eyes now that hadn't been there before. He walked the garage slowly, glancing at the Corvette, asking about the neighborhood, making small talk the way a man does when the actual subject of the conversation is too dangerous to approach directly. Eventually, he stopped in front of the car and looked at the engine bay for a long moment. He asked Mason whether he was thinking about getting back behind the wheel. Mason said no. He said he was just finishing something that should have been finished a long time ago. Logan looked at him for a beat longer than was comfortable, nodded once, and left. That same night, Isabella contacted Mason with an audio fragment, a partial recording of a phone conversation between Logan and a man connected to one of the betting pools that operated around Black Meridian. The audio was difficult to parse, partly obscured by ambient noise, but 2 phrases came through clearly: a reference to making sure the ghost line never finished, and a mention of a figure paid out after the last time someone had attempted to race Mason's design against him. The recording was not yet sufficient for publication, Isabella said, but it was enough to know what Logan was prepared to do. Mason spent the rest of that night installing a secondary brake actuation system, a simple, purely mechanical linkage that bypassed the electronic system entirely. and mounting a small wireless camera inside the dash, aimed at the instrument cluster and the engine warning display. If anything was done to the car before or during the race, the camera would record it. He pulled out of the garage at 11:40 at night. Madison stood at the side door in her coat, her arms crossed, trying to look calm in the way that people try to look calm when they are the furthest thing from it. Mason rolled down the window. She told him to come back. He told her that was the only plan he'd ever had. He watched her in the rearview mirror as the garage lights fell behind him, her small figure getting smaller against the yellow rectangle of the doorway, and he drove towards something he had been running from for 5 years, with the particular feeling of a man who has finally stopped fighting his own direction. Black Meridian that year occupied a decommissioned port facility on the edge of the city. A complex of loading docks, unfinished elevated roadway segments, and a half-mile of industrial tunnel that connected 2 warehouse districts through solid rock. The venue changed every year, always something that existed in a legal gray space between infrastructure and abandonment. Always something that Wyatt's operation transformed with generators, directional lighting, and the particular electricity of serious money gathered in a contained space. The guests arrived in vehicles that belonged in automotive museums and wore the studied nonchalance of people who had long since stopped being impressed by anything that didn't cost more than a house. Security perimeter teams circled the outer edge, and drones swept the approach corridors. There were no cameras from outside press. No official record, no liability. What happened at Black Meridian stayed inside the financial agreements that bound its participants. When Mason pulled the Corvette through the entry checkpoint, the sound that went through the staging area was not quite laughter. It was the specific sound of a large crowd reaching the same conclusion simultaneously. Every other car in the compound was gleaming and expensive and purposeful looking. The Brooks Venom prototype sat in a lit display area near the start line. Silver. Aggressive. Almost aggressively aerodynamic, representing tens of millions of dollars in development, investment, and every advantage that organizational money could produce. Against that, the Corvette looked like something a tow truck had deposited by mistake. Mason parked it, got out, and walked toward the registration table without any particular expression on his face. Evelyn found him before he reached the table. She was dressed in white, which Mason noticed as the choice of someone who expected to leave clean, and she had a cluster of investors and brand partners arranged around her like a supporting cast. She told the group, at a volume calibrated to carry, that Mason deserved tremendous credit for courage, because it took a certain kind of bold spirit to bring a structure fire to a performance event. The laughter was generous and easy, the laughter of people who had already decided where the story went. Mason looked at her steadily. He said she still had the habit of judging things by their paint. Evelyn began to respond, but Logan appeared at her elbow and drew her attention toward the display area, steering her away with the urgency of a man who does not want a particular conversation to continue. Wyatt announced the structure from the start platform. 3 consecutive stages, no rest between them. Stage 1 ran through the container loading docks, a narrow and technical corridor with limited sightlines and surface debris. Stage 2 climbed the unfinished elevated highway section, an incline followed by a series of decreasing radius corners that would punish any car with mass distribution problems. Stage 3 went through the industrial tunnel, a kilometer of darkness punctuated by lights the organizers had strung at intervals, with one notoriously blind left-hander at the 3/4 mark where the tunnel changed grade. The overall winner on accumulated time across all 3 stages claimed the purse and the contract. There was no second place worth mentioning. Mason noticed a figure moving near his car before the start. A man in a gray jacket approached the rear quarter panel with the focused body language of someone who was not a spectator and not a competitor. Mason crossed the staging area in 10 seconds and put himself between the man and the car. The man stepped back, collided with another competitor's team member, and used the confusion to walk quickly toward the crowd perimeter. As he turned, Mason saw a small secondary logo embroidered on the back cuff of his glove, a stylized B. the same mark that appeared on Brooks Automotive's technical division equipment. Mason went immediately to the car, ran his hands over every accessible surface, checked the wheel hubs and brake lines. Found nothing disturbed. The onboard camera had captured the approach. He filed that away and went to the start line. The race began at 1 in the morning. In the first 200 meters, Mason held the Corvette deliberately in the lower part of its power band, letting the pack sort itself, watching the Brooks Venom run cleanly away from him, while two hypercars jockeyed for position ahead. The crowd assumed exactly what he wanted them to assume. Evelyn watched the data feed in the operations area and allowed herself a moment of relief. Then Mason reached the first container corridor. He knew the surface from a reconnaissance pass he had done on foot the afternoon, before he had walked the entire route in work boots, noting the drainage grates, the loose aggregate near the wall joins, the gradient change at the midpoint of the corridor. He used that knowledge the way a surgeon uses anatomical memory, not to be cautious but to be precise. He shifted up 2 gears earlier than any other driver would have dared, used the width of the corridor that the other cars were avoiding out of margin instinct, and came out of the first stage gap with 3 seconds recovered and the car entirely intact. The crowd noise changed pitch. Evelyn looked up from her tablet. Stage 2 was where Logan's instructions took shape. Mason could hear the communications through a band he had been monitoring, not clearly, but in fragments. The Brooks Venom began running blocking lines, legal moves taken to the absolute edge of their legality, positioning the car to force Mason wide on the uphill section, where the outside of the road became a concrete barrier with nothing beyond it. Mason felt the pressure build in his hands. He felt, briefly, the specific texture of that night 5 years ago, the narrow canyon road, the car that wouldn't stop the way it should have. The moment Grace's headlights disappeared ahead of him and didn't come back, he felt it, recognized it, and set it aside. The bracelet on the gear shift caught the edge of his peripheral vision. He exhaled. He was not in that race anymore. He was in this one. He executed a technique he had developed in his earlier years and never taught to anyone, a counterintuitive release of lateral tension through the steering in the instant before a car's weight transferred across the axle, on a tight corner, which created a window of directional change that looked from outside like a loss of control and felt from inside like threading a needle in the dark. He used it on the 4th corner of the uphill section, sliding the Corvette across the outside of the track and back through a gap that the Brooks driver had not anticipated because no rational calculation would have suggested it was there. The time split showed Mason 2/10 behind the Venom at the Stage 2 checkpoint, where 30 seconds earlier he had been 4 seconds back. In the operations area, Isabella had quietly gained access to the media display infrastructure. She had the video file from Mason's onboard camera loaded on a drive, along with the documents she had accumulated over 2 years of investigation, the financial records showing Logan's payments from the betting collective before Grace's crash, the design file metadata demonstrating that the Venom's core combustion architecture had originated from a document folder timestamped to Mason's old engineering workstation over a decade earlier, and the audio fragment with Logan's voice. She was waiting for the right moment to make all of it visible on every screen in the venue simultaneously. She was waiting for Logan to act first. Logan acted. In the minutes before Stage 3, he activated a plan that Isabella later confirmed he had arranged with a network technician hired through a construction subcontractor. A plan that would darken the lights in the middle section of the tunnel at a specific time, targeting the blind corner where speed and darkness together would make correction nearly impossible. He also transmitted a jamming signal on the frequency used by the Corvette's electronic brake distribution module. Evelyn heard the order and told Logan to cancel it. Logan told her she didn't understand what was at stake. She told him she understood exactly what was at stake and that she would not allow it. Logan ignored her. What he did not account for was that Evelyn's authority in the Brooks operation system was still active, and she used it to revoke his access credentials from the communications relay 30 seconds before Stage 3 began. It was the first decision she had made that night that was not about winning. The tunnel was black and cold and loud, with the sound of engines compressed against stone. Mason ran without the electronic aids he had deliberately left unrestored during the rebuild, relying on physical feel through the pedals and column to manage entry speed. The lights went dark in the middle section, as Logan had arranged through the subcontractor channel that Evelyn hadn't been able to fully intercept. 40 meters of absolute blindness. The driver of the Brooks Venom, who had not been warned, lifted off completely, losing nearly 3 seconds. Mason had anticipated the darkness. He had noted the tunnel's geometry in his foot reconnaissance, knew the left-hander came 62 meters into the dark section, and ran the corner on feel and timing with his secondary mechanical brake engaged as primary. The car shook, the rear step out by more than he wanted. He corrected. He came through clean. The jamming signal hit his electronic module 2 seconds later. The warning panel lit red. The primary brake distribution went offline, exactly as Grace's had gone offline on a mountain road 5 years ago, and for a fraction of a second, Mason's body processed that information faster than his mind could organize it into language. Then his left hand was already on the mechanical override pull, and the mechanical system was already doing what it had been built to do: slow the car through the friction of raw physics. No electronics required. The car slewed. The rear tires burned against the tunnel floor, and the Corvette came out of the tunnel's exit ramp, running on raw momentum, and the particular ferocity of a machine that had been prepared for exactly this contingency by the person who knew, better than anyone alive, what someone might try to take away from it. The moment the cars cleared the tunnel mouth, Isabella activated every display screen in the venue. The footage from Mason's onboard camera rolled in real time. The gauge cluster, the warning indicators, the electronic fault codes appearing in sequence. Side by side with the live footage ran the document overlays. Logan's payment records, the design file timestamps, the audio recording. In the space of 40 seconds, every investor, every guest, every partner at Black Meridian watched the sequence of deliberate sabotage unfold on the same screens that had been showing them racing data. The reaction was the particular silence of wealthy people calculating consequences. The final stretch was a straight run from the tunnel exit to a broad, sweeping left-hander before the finish line. The Brooks Venom had more peak power. In a longer straight, it would have opened a gap that the Corvette couldn't answer. But the left-hander was Mason's, because the Corvette was lighter through the apex, and because Mason knew exactly when to brake late, and when to let the car move wide, and come back on the throttle exit with the rear tires planted. He gave the Venom the inside. The Venom took it and defended it, and was still defending it, when Mason bled off just enough speed to change his entry angle by 4 degrees, cut back under the apex on the exit, and came off the corner with the Corvette's nose pointing at the finish line and the gap already closed. He crossed the line by a little more than half a car length. The scorched black Corvette, the car that Evelyn Brooks had said was worth selling for its weight in scrap metal, had just beaten a factory prototype with the full resources of a billion-dollar automotive company behind it. Mason climbed out of the car. His hands were steady. The burn marks along his forearms from a small underhood fire in the tunnel were minor, and he didn't look at them. The crowd was loud around him in a different way than it had been when he arrived less certain of its own judgment. Recalibrated, he walked to Wyatt and gave him a single instruction before anything else was discussed. Transfer the prize deposit directly to Detroit Children's Hospital before the official paperwork was started. Wyatt looked at him for a moment, then nodded, and reached for his phone. Several people standing nearby went quiet in a way that had less to do with the instruction and more to do with what it said about the man who'd given it. Logan was escorted from the venue by Wyatt's security personnel. He did not go quietly, but he went. Evelyn stood near the Brooks operations area, watching the screen cycle through the evidence Isabella had posted. Her face was very still, and she was looking at things with the expression of someone who has just read a document that changes the meaning of everything they thought they understood. Mason walked past her without stopping. She said his name, not his title, not his role, his full name, Mason Carter, and he stopped. She said she owed him an apology. He looked at her directly and said that an apology didn't undo what power had cost people who had less of it, but that there was a difference between people who acknowledged damage and people who kept doing it, and he supposed she'd have to figure out which one she wanted to be. He walked back to his car. She stood watching him go, and for the first time since she had stepped into his garage and laughed at a burned-out Corvette, Evelyn Brooks had nothing to say. The investigation that followed Logan's removal from Black Meridian moved quickly once Isabella's materials were formally submitted. Logan was named in 3 proceedings: an intellectual property theft complaint filed by Mason through a law firm that took the case without a retainer, a criminal obstruction inquiry connected to the technical interference during the race, and a civil action opened by families of 2 other drivers who had experienced unexplained mechanical failures in races where Logan's financial interests were later identified as connected. Brooks Automotive's board of directors placed Evelyn on a compulsory leave of administrative authority pending internal review. The company's share value dropped sharply in the 2 weeks following Isabella's published account, which ran in full across multiple platforms and was picked up by the major business press. The investors who had backed the Venom program began publicly distancing themselves from the project. Madison's surgery was scheduled 4 days after Black Meridian. Mason sat in the corridor outside the operating suite for 6 hours and 20 minutes. He still had the bracelet. He held it loosely in his palm the whole time, not gripping it, just keeping it near. The hallway was the ordinary corridor of a children's hospital: linoleum floors, pastel paint, informational posters about hand hygiene, and Mason sat in it with the same stillness he brought to the garage at night, the kind that was not emptiness but concentration. The burns on his forearms had been treated and wrapped. A nurse had offered him coffee twice, and both times he had accepted, and both times he had forgotten to drink it. Somewhere in the building, surgeons were doing what surgeons did, and the particular architecture of Madison's heart was either yielding to the intervention or it wasn't, and there was nothing in Mason Carter's considerable capacity to fix things that touched any of it. Evelyn arrived in the corridor during the 4th hour. She came without her team, without a publicist, without a prepared statement. She carried a manila folder. She sat down in the chair 2 seats away from Mason, without asking whether she was welcome to sit, which was either rudeness or honesty. And Mason decided to call it honesty. She said she had some documents for him to look at when he was ready. He said he wasn't ready yet. She said she understood and set the folder on the seat between them and put her hands in her lap. They sat in silence for a while. Then Mason picked up the folder and opened it. Inside was a formal withdrawal of the compulsory purchase proceedings on his garage and property, an executed agreement returning all intellectual property rights to Mason Carter for any design work traceable to his original files, and a proposal document outlining the establishment of a foundation to fund pediatric cardiac surgeries for families below a certain income threshold. The foundation's proposed name was Grace Carter Access Fund. Mason said he had one question. He asked whether this was being done because it was right or because it was strategically useful for her to be seen doing it. Evelyn looked at him and said probably some of both, but that she had spent most of the previous week thinking about his daughter sitting in a waiting room with a drawing of a burned car, and that some of what she was feeling was harder to make strategic use of than others. He nodded without saying it was enough. He also didn't hand the folder back. The surgery was successful. Madison came out of anesthesia in the late afternoon, groggy and pale, and immediately trying to take inventory of everything around her. She asked about the car before she asked about the race, which was exactly what Mason expected. He told her the car had done what it was built to do. She said she knew because she had felt it in the bracelet when she'd put it on the gear shift. She said she could feel when things were working right. She always could. Mason laughed for the first time in a very long time. It wasn't a large laugh, but it was real, and it filled the small room and surprised him. The garage stayed a garage. It was repainted on the outside and better lit inside, and a small addition was built onto the east side, with a workbench low enough for teenagers to use comfortably. Mason ran the space on Saturday mornings as an open mechanical class free. No registration required. Just show up and learn to use your hands. The kids who came were the specific kind of kid Mason had once been. Old enough to understand that the world had sorted them into a category they hadn't chosen. Young enough to still believe the category could be wrong. He didn't teach them to race. He taught them to think through a problem without assuming it was bigger than they were. Evelyn went through the full review process at Brooks Automotive with the kind of transparency that surprised people who had assumed she would fight it. She answered questions, released documents, and declined the communications team's advice to frame her cooperation as voluntary leadership. She said it was not voluntary leadership, it was accountability, which was a different thing, and she thought the distinction was worth making even if it cost her something. The internal review concluded with a structured governance change, rather than a full removal. She resumed operational authority with a board oversight committee in place and several new faces in the executive team. The Corvette was never repainted. Mason moved it into the corner of the garage where it could be seen from the street through the wide bay doors. The burned exterior stayed burned not as a decorative choice but as a factual one. He had considered doing the cosmetic work and decided against it because the car's history was part of what it was. The fire had happened, and Grace had happened, and the race had happened, and Madison was alive, and all of those things were connected in a way that couldn't be honored by making the outside look like the inside hadn't gone through them. Some things needed to stay marked. On a morning in the early part of summer, Mason put Madison in the passenger seat and drove out to the lake road that curved around the south shore of the reservoir district. The Corvette's engine was warm and even, the sound of something that had been built correctly and was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Madison had her window down, her arm out in the airflow, and she was not drawing or reading or watching anything, she was just watching the road go by. They did not talk much. The lake was on their left, and the tree line was on their right. And the road was theirs for the full length of the morning because it was early, and nobody else had gotten there yet. There was no finish line ahead of them. There was no crowd, no stakes, no one deciding what the car was worth or what the man driving it deserved. There was only the road and the engine and the light coming through the trees. And for the first time in 5 years, Mason Carter was not running away from anything. He was simply driving forward, which, for a man who had been through everything that he had been through, was more than enough.